Welcome to this episode of the Great Lives series. Today, we're going to look at the story of Cleopatra. She has been remembered for 2,000 years primarily as a legendary beauty who seduced two of the most powerful men in Rome. The ancient writers who actually knew her tell a different story. A woman who spoke as many as a dozen languages fluently, ran a sophisticated court and administration, and outmaneuvered rivals, brothers, and empires for the better part of 2 decades, only to lose, in the end, to the one force even she couldn't outnegotiate. This is the story of Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, and one of the most politically capable rulers of the ancient world. Cleopatra VII was born around 70 or 69 BC in Alexandria, Egypt, into the Ptolemaic dynasty, a line of rulers descended from Ptolemy I, a Macedonian Greek general who had served under Alexander the Great and seized control of Egypt after Alexander's death nearly 3 centuries earlier. Cleopatra herself was ethnically Macedonian Greek, part of a ruling family that had governed Egypt for generations, largely in Greek, rarely bothering to learn the language of the people they actually ruled. Cleopatra broke sharply with that tradition. Ancient sources credit her with fluency in as many as 9 to 12 languages, including, notably, Egyptian itself, reportedly the first ruler in her entire dynasty to bother learning it, allowing her to speak directly with foreign ambassadors and her own subjects alike without ever needing a translator standing between them. The Ptolemaic royal family had a long, brutal history of internal power struggles. Marriages between siblings intended to keep the bloodline and the throne within the family, and a fairly routine willingness to eliminate rival relatives when necessary, and Cleopatra's own path to the throne was no exception to any of it. Her father, Ptolemy XII, had ruled amid constant political instability and had relied heavily on Roman support simply to stay in power, a dependency on Rome that Cleopatra inherited along with the crown itself. Following Egyptian and Ptolemaic royal custom, she became co-ruler in 51 BC at around 18 years old, married to her own younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, a political arrangement rather than any real personal relationship. Within a few years, rival factions at court, wary of a young queen exercising real independent authority, pushed her out of power entirely, forcing her into exile while her brother's advisors ran the kingdom in his name instead. Her path back to power ran directly through Rome's own civil war. In 48 BC, Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria pursuing his defeated rival, Pompey. Determined to plead her case directly, and unwilling to risk her brother's guards intercepting her, Cleopatra reportedly had herself smuggled into the palace, rolled inside a carpet, or by some ancient accounts, a bedding sack, to be delivered directly into Caesar's presence without anyone else knowing she had even entered the building. Whatever the precise method, the gambit worked. Caesar backed Cleopatra's claim to the throne. Her brother died fleeing the resulting conflict, and Cleopatra was restored to power, this time as queen alongside an even younger, largely symbolic brother. Cleopatra and Caesar became partners, both politically and personally, and in 47 BC she gave birth to a son, Ptolemy Caesar, known popularly as Caesarion, whom she maintained was Caesar's own child, though Caesar himself never formally acknowledged the boy as an heir back in Rome, likely wary of the political backlash a foreign half-Egyptian heir would provoke among the Roman elite. Cleopatra traveled to Rome herself with Caesarion, and was still there in March of 44 BC, when Caesar was assassinated by a group of Roman senators, forcing her to quickly return to Egypt without the protector who had restored her throne. What followed was a fresh Roman power struggle, this time between Caesar's former allies and his assassins, and Cleopatra found herself once again navigating exactly which Roman faction to align Egypt and herself with, fully aware that backing the wrong side could end both her reign and her love. She chose Mark Antony, one of the three men now sharing power in Rome, as part of an uneasy triumvirate, and their first meeting at Tarsus in 41 BC became one of the most famously theatrical encounters in ancient history. Cleopatra, arriving on an elaborately decorated barge with purple sails and silver oars, dressed to evoke the goddess Venus, deliberately stunning the Roman general with a display of wealth and spectacle he had never encountered from any provincial ruler before. A calculated performance rather than simple vanity, designed to establish from the very first meeting exactly which of the two of them held the greater claim to divine favor and cultural sophistication. Antony and Cleopatra became genuine political and personal partners, eventually having three children together, twins named Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and later a third son, Ptolemy Philadelphus. Much of Cleopatra's enduring reputation as a scheming seductress rather than a serious ruler actually originates from this exact period, not from neutral historical fact, but from Roman political propaganda deliberately spread by Antony's rival, Octavian, who found it far more useful to portray Antony as a Roman general, seduced and weakened by a foreign Eastern queen, than to admit he was fighting an ordinary Roman civil war against a legitimate political rival. Ancient writers who actually described Cleopatra in person, notably the historian Plutarch, wrote that her physical beauty was not in itself considered exceptional, but that her voice, wit, and sheer conversational charm made her presence almost impossible to resist, a very different portrait from the legendary beauty later centuries would remember her as. In 34 BC, Antony publicly granted Cleopatra and her children rule over a series of eastern territories in a ceremony known as the Donations of Alexandria, and crucially, publicly declared Caesarion the true son and rightful heir of Julius Caesar, a direct challenge to Octavian, who had built his own entire political legitimacy on being Caesar's adopted heir instead. Octavian used the moment expertly, framing the coming conflict not as a Roman civil war against Antony, politically risky to sell to the Roman public, but as a foreign war against Cleopatra herself, a much easier narrative for Roman audiences to rally behind. The decisive battle came at Actium in 31 BC, a major naval engagement off the western coast of Greece, in which Antony and Cleopatra's combined forces were decisively defeated by Octavian's fleet under the command of his general Agrippa. The couple fled back to Egypt, and the following year Octavian invaded, marching on Alexandria itself. Mark Antony, wrongly informed that Cleopatra had already died, took his own life by falling on his sword, dying, according to ancient accounts, in Cleopatra's own arms shortly afterward once the misunderstanding became clear. Cleopatra, facing capture and the near-certain prospect of being paraded through the streets of Rome in chains as a conquered trophy for Octavian's own triumph, chose to die on her own terms, rather than allow him that particular satisfaction. The most famous account holds that she used an asp, a venomous Egyptian snake, smuggled to her inside a basket of figs, though ancient sources themselves disagreed on the exact details. And some modern historians have suggested a prepared poison as an equally or more plausible method. Egypt was formally annexed as a province of Rome immediately afterward, bringing an end to the Ptolemaic dynasty and, with it, the end of more than 3,000 years of pharaonic rule along the Nile. Octavian ordered Caesarion executed shortly after, reportedly remarking that the world could not sustain two men both named Caesar, eliminating the one direct rival claim to Julius Caesar's legacy. Cleopatra's children with Antony were treated far more mercifully, spared and raised in Rome under the care of Antony's own Roman wife, Octavia, who happened also to be Octavian's sister. Cleopatra remains, more than 2,000 years later, one of the most instantly recognizable figures from the ancient world, and also one of the most persistently misunderstood. She was a genuinely skilled administrator and linguist who governed one of the ancient world's wealthiest kingdoms through decades of relentless external threat, using every political and personal tool available to her to keep Egypt independent for as long as she possibly could. That she is remembered today more for her romances than her statecraft says rather less about who Cleopatra actually was, and considerably more about which side ultimately won the war, and got to write the history afterward. If this story moved you, do two quick things before you go. Hit like on this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next episode of the Great Lives series.